Information material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
And thank you so much, everybody. I'm very happy that you're all here. This is there's a lot of stuff that's going on. And if you don't mind, just give me one moment, please.
Take your time, Alex. We're not rushing, that's for sure. I mean, we're not in a hurry, so to speak.
Well, what I'd like to do is, let's see here. How does this, are we seeing the screen now?
Yes, we are. We're seeing your first background screen with Mr. Kesh, the Kesh Foundation, Spaceship Institute.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you again for coming here. It is a very important time, and for a lot of us, we really don't understand because there's so many things to understand, and the learning curve is phenomenal. But we have to go through it because that's what life is for. Life is for learning, and so to timestamp everything, we have to understand that we have arrived in the post-Sanya conference era. And we know that there's gold in them Dar hills. And do we know how to mine for this gold? And that involves methodologies, different kinds of methods. And so today, this is the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings of Plasma Science. We're in the advanced transition stage. We're going to discuss parasites. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is July the 21st, 2024, and this is part of the Kesh Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So the ongoing teaching, and it will continue to be ongoing, not just by me, but by many other teachers. And the point is that we're over a decade into this public teaching. And so we are going through various levels, various dimensions, and various types of understanding. And for most of us, the key point is that we have to understand in terms that we can relate to. And I'm sure we can all relate to parasites. And I don't need to make any further comment on that particular point. But what we'd like to say is that this is, we're on the hesitancy highway, and we need to get on the plasma highway. And the problem with the hesitancy highway, not only is it the lowest energy state, but it makes life very hard. And it's really hard when, you have parasites hanging onto you. So we need to get up on that horse. And, there's always a relationship. So, we see where there's smoke, there's fire. And when you have fire, well, you want to put the fire out with water. And where there's water, there's a beach. And where there's a beach, well, last week we found out there's a beach ball. And wherever there's a ball, well, there's a party. And isn't that what life is all about? Life is just one big party. And so as we're searching for outer space, we always ask, well, how do we get to our party plasma highway, to our pie in the sky? It's the party highway that we want, isn't it? We're just a bunch of party animals. And so when you look at the books of Marantava Kolikesh and you say, well, book number 1, the first party is the universal order, creation of matter. And then, of course, once you finish with that party, you're looking for another party, and you use book number 2, the structure of the light. And then once you get to that party, well, you start to see that there's a lot of other parties, but maybe there's a party that we've missed. And this is book number 3, the origin of the universe. And so once we discover the origin of the universe, then we have to figure out which party do we want to go to. And is that the only decision that we have to make? Is that the only choice that's on the table? And so we find that the most important party is our Earth party. And so we've been trying for 335 weeks in a row to bring together this Earth planet together as one planet, one nation, and one race for justice and world peace. This is brought to you by Rick Crammond as host and the members of the Universal Council. Why is that? Because those who are in charge are abdicating their responsibility, and you cannot have authority without responsibility. There's no way to get on the plasma highway using those kinds of ethics. So we stay on the transmission highway, and we're looking for ways to get to transition to the transition highway. The transition is to the transition. And that's the part that we're stuck with, because we have our MAGRAPH pie chart, and of course we want our little piece of the pie. So to understand that, we have to understand that the speed of light is a constant transmission. This is the scientific thing. But how does light have variable transitions? And now we've graduated to the point where we see that the universe is 99% hydrogen. So we still haven't fulfilled the universe. So what is the rest? Is it garbage? Or is it where we are, or where we're supposed to be, or too many questions, right? So we have to understand the terminology a little bit better. So when we looked at the basic terminology in the beginning, we've seen that the X, Y, and Z axis are 3 dimensions that have characteristics of transmission, transition, and transmutation, and they involve rotation, polarity, and field strength. And so that is fine for our physicality, but there are other energy levels, and so we need to transition to them. Well, in order to transition, we have to go through a transition dimension. And interestingly enough, we've discovered that a transition dimension also has an X, Y, and Z axis. And in order to carry this transmission, we have to decide on which level and which energy state we are going to do this transmission. So in other words, you can transition on a lower energy state, or you can transition to a higher energy state and do the transmission there. And so if that is the case, then the question is, how does the message travel? And so therefore, the message is not the medium. the transmission level is the medium, and the message travels on the medium. This is the key point. And so this message, in many ways, is a force. And we can see that in order to create a MAGRAV, we have to start bringing two forces together. And so is that two messages. And when they come together, they create the X and Y dimension, which represent the X and Y axis. And so this could be a point of conflict. So in order to proceed beyond this, we have to have a conflict resolution. And that conflict resolution then becomes a point of containment, because we still have to keep this X and Y axis within our field. So last week we were discussing the Z axis, which is the field. And so this is part of the creation of the universe. So fundamentally, the universe exists from energy, and when it comes together, it creates a structure. And it had to get here as a structure. So that structure is an energy pack, and that energy pack, of course, is positive. So the charge of the energy pack is the motion, because energy is always in motion. And so when we look at the structure of light, it comes from one structure and goes to another structure. So in between, it has to maintain that structure, doesn't it? And if it's coming and going from one place to another, then things are working in combination. But the reality here is that when we transmit from one structure to another structure, we can do this by transitioning through different energy dimensions. And because of this, at some structure, we're in one dimension of energy strength, and in another structure, we could be in another energy strength. And so this is kind of difficult to understand, because we understand field capture, how the x-axis transition comes together and the y-axis transition comes together, and then you have the z-axis transition, but all of these are relative to the ground, except when you get into the transition stage, you question, well, which ground are we talking about? And so on that ground, we can move on that ground, and so that becomes our x-axis dimension, but then we can go around the ground, and that becomes our y-axis dimension by polarity, and then we can go from ground to ground, and that becomes our z-axis dimension. And of course, there's an interdependence there, because if you're going to be on one ground, you have to be beside the other ground. And is that how life is working? Well, fortunately, we have the gravitational confirmation that is how life is working, because we have the ground from the sun and the ground from the earth. But in plasma terms, what we have is the convergence of the magnetical field forces from the sun and from the earth. And so, well, that's fine, but we have this gravitational confirmation called hydrogen. And so this hydrogen has a fingerprint, and this fingerprint is in color, and we can see this color. And what is it representing? Well, it's representing the gravitational confirmation of hydrogen, which has come from the source. And so from the source is coming this energy pack, which is part of the principal matter. And of course, to be a pack, it has to be parceled very nicely. So it's parceled within itself. And how does it do that? So we're looking at the basic equatorial rotation versus the polar rotation, and we see that there's an interaction. And because of this interaction, we see the package of this Earth. So this Earth is a form artifact of a manifestation of the principal matter interaction of the energy pack and its method of parceling. And so when we look at the Earth and we see the method of its parceling, and isn't it interesting? We have land, we have water, we have atmosphere, and we have a whole lot of other things, and these are all part of the principal interaction of energy and motion. And because energy in motion, it comes from one to another, but because it has a direction, it has a charge, so that means it's a two-way street. And so on that two-way street, we have two-way transmission. And then, of course, we also have two-way transmission because we haven't decided which street, because we can see that there's energy from the sun and there's energy from the Earth. And the sun is different from the Earth, significantly different. It's also significantly larger. So the other factor of the principal interaction is that there's an interaction between the sun and the Earth. So fundamentally, whichever way you want to do it, we see that we have to maintain our own MAGRAV position. So our fingerprint is that we are the blue planet, we are the water planet, and this becomes a key point because water is the universal solvent of life. And so this is the fundamental energy flow. And so the energy flow that manifests this energy in motion on a two-way street is self-contained within the planet of the Earth. And so in order to do that, we have to understand the plasma rule where the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. And so this is in stark contrast to the conflict point that we get when the higher strength eats the weaker strength. So in order to understand the negative charge principle, the negative gives and the positive takes. And in that regard, if it's giving and taking from itself, then it's fairly binding. But if it's giving and taking from others, then it's flowing. And so this is very good. But how do we know the difference between the negative and the positive? So when we look at the surface to volume ratios, we find that as the particle gets smaller, the surface to volume ratio gets higher. And as it gets higher, it becomes more negative. And so when it becomes highly negative, it becomes a feeding dimension. So therefore, the opposite is true. When it becomes more gravitational, then it becomes a feedback dimension. And so we find that in basic math, we say 1 and 1 is 2, but in plasma science, 1 and 1 is more than 2. But we're not saying how much more than 2. We're just saying there's more, because fundamentally you have one feeding dimension and then you have another feeding dimension, and they're not necessarily the same one. And then when you get the feedback dimension, in order to maintain that feedback dimension, you have to retain the original 2. And so that becomes a balanced equation. And if 1 and 1 is more than 2, then that doesn't seem to be very balanced. And there's something that's missing. Well, of course, we're the ones that are missing because we're not part of this equation. We're just the observers of this. And so somehow, some way, we can go from one gravitational form field to another gravitational form field. And we have chosen Earth. So in order to understand our physicality, we have cells. And so cells are kind of the basic structural and functional unit of all forms of life. And within the cell, we have this cytoplasm. And it's enclosed within a membrane. And there are organelles inside, each with a specific function. So the basic part of cells is that they're capable of replication. They do protein synthesis, and they have motility. And the largest agglomeration of cells are whales. And as we discussed before, they are commonly infected with caliciviruses. And these viruses could cause rashes, blisters, and gastroenteritis in marine animals. And they could infect humans. And because these are big mammals, they excrete a large quantity, a massive quantity of caliciviruses. And they do this daily. There is a problem here. And that problem is that these caliciviruses have been seen. So one has to really question the surface to volume ratio here. So in the past, we've talked about a trophic sequence. And so that sequence is important because as we understand in, let's say like Darwinian theory, or the larger eats the smaller, the implication, of course, is that the larger is stronger and the smaller is weaker. So the stronger eats the weaker. And so there are other trophic sequences which we haven't discussed, and these are heterotrophic and autotrophic. And so we're going to discuss them more today because our subject matter is parasites. So what are parasites? They're an organism that lives on or in a host organism and gets its food from or at the expense of its hosts. Does that sound familiar? Well, for instance, when we look at some examples, and these include tapeworms, fleas, grubs, cockroaches, wasps, ants, termites, and mosquitoes, bacteria, viruses, and algae. These are just some of the examples. There are other examples, but what the examples are energy binding for self-serving purposes. So we also find that our social structure in many ways is done this way. The self-serving is very important because in terms of energy binding, we create this MAGRAV condition of a balanced field in some dimension. And we need to have this self-serving to maintain this MAGRAV position. But when we do it at the expense of others, as we do in our social structure on this planet, the other person is also energy binding and also doing it for self-serving purposes. And if you are robbing them, then they are in a predicament. Then they have to supplement that energy. Now, do they have to give it to you? No, there could be a conflict. There could be a war. Or they could set up a barrier. They have these choices. And then, of course, they could just pass it on domino effect like, and well, if you're going to rob me through lying, cheating, stealing, deception, and war, I will do the same. And so this is where we have the conflict on this planet. It causes disruption. So when we look at the plasma manifestation and we understand that it precedes the physical manifestation, then we see that the physical manifestation can, of course, manifest differently in different people. Although the plasmatic manifestation is the same, which is to say that if someone is robbing or stealing you from your energy binding needs, then the physical manifestation may manifest differently in different people. Some people become sick. Some people become homeless. Some people may suffer from obesity, others from blood pressure or from cancer. And these conditions are acidic. And so we find that the higher acidity causes an anaerobic condition. It does cause a DNA expansion, which affects ATP production, which is adenosine triphosphate, and it affects cellular communication. And cellular communication is really important, especially because we're very complex organisms. We're not as big as whales, but we sure do have an awful lot of cells. And so the stability of these cells is based on the water. And to understand that, we have a pH scale of hydrogen. And in it, we see that there's a range from the complex to the simple. The complex being alkaline, the simple being acidic, the complex being gravitational, the simple being magnetic. Well, obviously, the more complex it is, the more stable it is. And then there's a range to go down to the unstable, which is the opposite, and all points in between, which is what we're referencing as susceptibility. And we haven't determined what causes a susceptibility. All what we see is that there's a range, and this range can be reflected in the potentiation of strength as well, where we find that the strong is gravitational and the weak is magnetical. And then, of course, the strong is strong because there's initial potential energy, and the weak, of course, is expired its potential energy and converted it to kinetic energy. So when we look at simple organisms, one of the simplest is algae. And algae is any of a large and diverse group of photosynthetic organisms. They are single-celled. But there's also blue-green algae. And some blue-green algae is healthier than others. Some is harmful. And then there's filamentous or string algae. And this is beyond a singular cell because now it has a string and it makes a natural water filter. So just the subject of algae can be oxygen depleting or oxygen donating, and this becomes very important. So what is the relationship of a cell to an atom? So to function as an atom, and the original definition of an atom, we found that it is uncut, has electron and proton. And so the question is, can you cut up a maggrav? Because a maggrav consists of a magnetical and gravitational interaction. And so what about a cell? And so we find that in order to be a cell, it has to be self-contained so that it can reproduce and function. But regardless of how small you are, what you eat is smaller. And if it is too large, then you have to cut it up. So that means that all cells are not the same size. And if we say that, then we could say that all atoms are not the same size either. And we know that is true because we see different elements on the periodic table of elements. So how do we get to these various levels? So there are some sequence orders, and they are determined by the gravitational field forces of attraction, which is part of the feedback, and the magnetical field forces of repulsion, which is part of the feeding. And what is our involvement? Well, we are the last man standing, and we have choices. In other words, those choices are we can turn on and turn off the feeding, or increase or decrease the strength, or enhance or diminish our positioning. And so the way we do that is where the stronger feeds the weaker. When I say that's the way that we do that, that's how we were born and that's how we grew. But our society is not functioning that way. So when we look at the potentiation of hydrogen, we have to understand that is a combination of acidic and alkaline forces. And so the neutral acidic condition is 7, but the neutral alkaline condition is 7 also. And 7 and 7 is 14. And this is why the water splitting is always a pH of 14, because that's a scale. And in that scale, we have potentiation layers. We call this the y-axis transition because when we transition from a pH of 7, say down to 6, the corresponding pH that is created, of course, is 8. 6 and 8 is 14. And if we go down another layer, 5 and 9 is 14, and another layer down, 4 and 10 is 14, and so on. So we find that there is a correspondence, and we can relate this as like a pH zipper. But there is a transmission along this pH zipper, and somehow it goes through these various layers. And in order to do that, there has to be a relationship to the transition. And it is at that point that we take into account the transmission and the transition, then we can talk about the transmutation. But what is this pH transition? And so we find that it is filled with peaks and valleys. And so we can call these peaks and valleys attraction points and repulsion points. So if we were attracted to a pH of 4, then we're also attracted to a pH of 10. But if we're repelled from, say, a pH of 5, then we're also repelled from a pH of 9. What causes this attraction and repulsion? So we see that density plays a big part. And so we find that there's a different characteristic in this density. Low density is acidic and high density is alkaline. And since gravity seeks density, we find that in the pH sense, with respect to oxygen and hydrogen, oxygen is more dense than hydrogen. And there is a range. That range is within a range of pH of 14. And so when we look at the cups of life, the thing is we had these physical components, and these were in the physical range. But these cups of life produced a GANS, which was in an emotional range and a representation of a physical range. And these were representative of an emotional strength. So this emotional strength has its own energy level. It's representative of our inner space. It's also representative of some nebulous point in outer space. And the way we were able to transition from the lowest energy state of the physical science was to go through this nanocoding process. And so we didn't cut up the atom. What we did was we created a monatomic structure. But the GANS itself is monatomic, but it's much bigger. So if we talk about a monatomic structure, we have to decide how big is the monatomic structure. Because if the atomic structure is not of the same size and the cellular structure is not of the same size, then the GANS structure also won't be of the same size because of its field strength. And we know this because when we produced the GANS, we created carbon dioxide GANS, calcium, zinc, and copper GANS, water GANS, and amino acid GANS. And now we see that we can create gold GANS as well. And what does that mean to us? It means that we have these differences in manifestation, which are all part of the GANS radiance. And where did this come from? And what does it mean? Well, in terms of the cups of life, one cup represents our emotional context, and the second cup represents our physical context. And of course, the two together represent our physicality. So we see that our physicality, of course, is uncut because we have a whole body. But many of us get caught up in the process of living. So there are hazards. But fundamentally, we are able to progress through different levels of susceptibility. And we find that within each point of susceptibility, we have this convergence of forces that come together to create this gravitational stability of wherever we are. So if we're looking at a pH of 5, within the pH of 5, there's a gravitational stability. But at the same time, within the pH of 9, which is the corresponding pH, there also is a gravitational stability. But with respect to the difference between the pH of 5 and the pH of 9, the pH of 9 represents a gravitational stability, and the pH of 5 represents a magnetical stability. So something in the y-axis transition dimension is causing this change. And that's a good thing. We know because look at all the elements that we have on our Earth space. And so each gravitational stability that we see on the periodic table of elements represents an element. And then, in addition to these elements, we have combination of elements. So the amino acid is a combination of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen. And then we see the mediums involve sodium, magnesium, phosphorus, and calcium. I'm sorry, potassium and calcium. And then, of course, we have our emotional and physical strength represented by copper and zinc. And our planet and our grounding to this planet is through the iron and the blood. And then the planet itself is silicon-based. So what's interesting is that the water is a combination of hydrogen and oxygen. And the oxygen is way bigger than the hydrogen, and yet it is a round maggrav. So this becomes a very important point because the oxygen is gravitational and the hydrogen is magnetical, and the combination of those two create this maggrav, which in essence is uncut. But when we do cut it up, in other words, when we do shear off one of the hydrogens, we're left with a energy pack. We call that hydrogen. And then there's another energy pack, we call it the hydroxyl. So since energy is always positive, then the hydrogen is positive, and the hydroxyl, since it's lost that energy, now becomes in a negative position. And so the negative is looking for some kind of combination, either through a crossover or deflection or a twisting. And when we get into this twisting, we get this tightening, coiling, and tunneling. And so we find that there's a lot of activity going on, and so energy is always in motion. And historically, we've had a problem with understanding energy in motion because of this electron fixation fallacy that we've had. So we find that in the theory of positrons, there is no annihilation of energy. There's no creation either. Only a change of direction of moving particles. And they say it's from the past to the future, or from the future to the past. But is that true? Because we see that somehow we went from the atomic physicality and we created the nanostructure, and then from the nanostructure we created the GAN structure. But the truth of the matter is even though we refer to these as plasmatic energy fields, all three of these fields are plasmatic energy fields. In other words, the physicality and its manifestation is a plasmatic field. It's just that it has a different characteristic. And so we ignore the fact that it's a member of the plasmatic reality, and we just call it part of the physical reality. And from that point of view, everything else is kind of voodoo science. And yet what we've seen is with the nanocoating, we've been able to create a superconductor at room temperature, and then we've gone into the GAN state, which we've been able to create other force fields like emotion and field strength, and do many wonderful things with it. But it begs the question of what is going on beyond there, because let's face it, we can see the nano coating and we can see the GANS coating, but can we see what's beyond it? So what we're talking about is relationships. And so we have this dichotomy of the scientific community and the spiritual community. And as plasma scientists, we try and bring these two together. So not only that we can have this maggrav balance, but also to add to the knowledge. Because until we're able to rationalize this relationship, it's difficult to add to the knowledge. There's a reluctance. In fact, by the standard definition of inertia, we are on the hesitancy highway, and we'll stay on the hesitancy highway until there's a energy input that'll move us off that highway. And so staying on that highway observes the conservation of energy laws, where we see the balance between the kinetic and potential energy equal to the final kinetic and final potential energy. So the equalness becomes a susceptibility point because it's always equal. The equalness is always constant. It's just that the kinetic and potential energies are variable. And so if we say that the kinetic energy is magnetical and the potential energy is gravitational, as we've discussed before, then we see the variableness of the magnetical and gravitational relationship on one side of the formula is equal to the magnetical gravitational relationship on the other side of the formula. And so that becomes a conservation of our mag graph, isn't it? And so the relationship that we have on the one side will certainly affect the pH. And of course, it'll affect the other side and will certainly affect the pH. So therefore, the positioning of the mag graph becomes susceptible to the balance of the field forces of the magnetical and gravitational force fields on both sides. And did we say where those sides were? So one of the things that we know is that when the energy in motion is looking for a pattern, and so we have a template of a spiral codon we see in our DNA, it creates a spiral growth. And some clever people have found a very practical application of manufacturing something in the spiral format. And of course, that spiral can grow and create a tube. And then we come with a tubular form artifact. And so we see that this spiral formation is part of a twisting susceptibility that derives from the interaction of the hexagonal gravitational form of energy and the pentagonal magnetical form of energy. And so that energy product we understand as sugar. But that doesn't just come in one dimension, it comes in 3 dimensions. So we even have the, shall we say, the coiling into a manifestation of another form artifact, and it would have 3 dimensions. And so we'd like to investigate that a little bit more because one of those form artifacts is a parasite. And so a question becomes is, well, what is it like to live like a parasite? And who better to ask than a parasite? And so the answer would be, well, you know, it takes a lot of guts. And when we say guts, are we talking about intestinal fortitude? Well, interestingly enough, when a lion catches its prey, what it does is it eats the guts first, the intestines, in other words. And the reason for that is because there is bacteria in the intestinal tract. And as the animal that it is eating depends on that bacteria to process the food that it ate, the lion is depending on that bacteria to process the food that the lion will feed from the prey itself. So in other words, it has to have the bacteria first to be able to process the food. So that becomes a bacterial feeding. So what is bacteria then? Bacteria, see, requires a host. And that bacteria lives as an aerobic bacteria because at that point it lives in an oxygen abundant environment. But when that host dies, then it no longer supports that host because that host has gone into an anaerobic condition, and that means it's living in an oxygen depleted environment, and the bacteria itself becomes anaerobic. And then instead of supporting the host, it eats the host. So in fact, it's completely flipped over. It is no longer gravitational, it is magnetical. And we see that because that bacteria is going from an alkaline state, which is very stable and supports the host, to a very acidic state, which is unstable. And then at that point, it eats the host. And so we see roadkill, for instance, disappear in 9 days if we do nothing about it, because the bacteria that is within the gut cleans up everything. So we find that the bacteria is a very small organism, but it seems to have a life of its own. And there's another small organism we call plankton, and that is in the water, and it's an organism that is carried by tides and currents. And in the plankton world, they are considered as a heterotrophic feeder. In other words, they eat phytoplankton. So as tiny as plankton is, it has to eat something that's even tinier. And so it'll eat a cyanobacteria, which lives off of the production of energy through photosynthesis. So it doesn't require any mouth. And it seems to be self-contained as a cell. And it seems to have a lot going on inside. So what is heterotrophic? So that requires a complex organic compound of nitrogen and oxygen for metabolic synthesis, excuse me. So we understand that metabolism is the casting out. That's what it means. And so this nitrogen and oxygen that is required is obtained from plant or animal matter. Does not specify if it's living or dead, or doesn't specify if it's healthy or dying. And then, of course, there's autotrophic. This only is an organism that requires carbon dioxide or carbonates as a source of carbon and a simple inorganic nitrogen compound for metabolic synthesis of organic molecules such as sugar. Well, glucose, as we know, goes through a phosphorylation process and becomes fructose. And fructose, of course, is sugar. And of course, this autotrophic sequencing does not require a specified exogenous factor for normal metabolism. So a lion would require the meat of its prey. Well, we do the same thing. We not only eat animals, which are horizontal people, but we eat plants as well, which is part of the vertical people. So we are not autotrophic. Autotrophic are phosphorus-limited organisms. And it's difficult sometimes to tell which way they're going because you don't know which way is the head and which way is the tail. But one thing is very interesting. These are simple single-celled organisms, and yet when you look inside, there's a whole lot of other stuff going on inside, and that doesn't look very simple. And then we talk about tubes. Well, some of these organisms, they eat in a strange way. They filter, and they have a tube, and they gather up all the other stuff that they want to eat. And in this picture, you can see that they gathered up a lot of stuff, and they're in the process of digesting it. Well, how big is that tube when this organism is microscopic? And how does it know which way is forward? How does it know what it wants to eat? Which education institute did it go to? And then, of course, there's another organism that they do encapsulation. And so somehow they say, well, come to me. And then once you come to me, well, come inside me. Well, how does that happen? You know, where exactly is the mouth? And I guess the mouth is kind of wherever it's convenient for whatever they're eating to come inside. And then, of course, there's the fisherman, and a fisherman has a pole, and it also has a fishing line. And so you get these hair-like structures. And in order to maintain the integrity of these hair-like structures, there has to be some kind of rigidity. And so the structure of these hair-like structures are spiral forms, and they manifest themselves in a spiral. And so if we're looking at these microscopic organisms, what size are these hair-like structures? And so not only are they positioned in a way to attract the prey, but they are hollow in a way to secrete a compound that paralyzes the prey. And you can clearly see that the radiance of these hair-like structures come from a gravitational point and extend out in a magnetical direction. And that the ends of these hairline structures repel each other because they have an extremely high negative charge. And so they create this wonderful pattern, and it's very attractive. And you know, if you happen to be the unfortunate prey, and you come within range, or you get injected with this toxicity, which renders you defenseless, and then you get digested by this organism. Well, there's another, and these are simple organisms, right? Well, there's another one, we call it a cytoplasm sucker. And conveniently, its name is Suctorian. And as you can see, these hairs, well, they don't just come out of one location, they come out of many different locations, but these locations are very specific. These locations are at the points. And so we understand the points have a higher negative charge than the in between the points. And so we see the hairs coming out of these points. And of course, they're doing the same thing. They diverge towards the magnetical side. And because of the surface to volume ratio at the end points, they're highly negative. And of course, they repel each other. So there is a divergence. And so these are highly efficient fishermen because here you have a sectorian star formation because these hairs are doing the same thing. And it looks like, oh my God, he's surrounded by his food. But the reality is that he has surrounded himself with his nutrition. And is slowly sucking the life out of each and every one of them. So this is kind of unusual because the combination of the four is much bigger than the sectorian in the middle. And yet, the sectorian is at the gravitational point, and the other organisms are at the magnetical point. In order to control pesticides, pests and parasites, one of the products that we use is diatom powder. And diatom powder is actually a silicon dioxide, and it's used for parasites. And, looking at the microscopic condition, we see that it's kind of round in its magrav structure. So this diatom powder is actually diatomaceous earth, which is part of silica, and has been mined for decades. So it's a microscopic skeletons of algae, which we call diatoms. And compare this to what we call as atoms or monotoms. Anyway, these are concentrated sources of silica, and they are food grade, industrial grade, and parasites don't like them. So not all structures like this are, shall we say, parasitic. But silica is not something that we can breathe, but it is something that we can ingest. And we find that if we do ingest diatomaceous earth, if in our guts we have worms, which are anchored in our guts and basically competing with us for the nutrients of the food that we eat, we can find that within very short few days that the worms will release their anchorage and be flushed out with everything else. And this is an important point because we find that 25% of the North American population has worms in the gut. We need the bacteria to process the food, but we don't need competition from the worms in our guts for our nutrients. There's enough competition in the world. So there has to be a balance. And we need to understand that in the plasma science, there is a balance of energy. And so if we look at a frozen Gans ball in a container of water, And isn't it interesting that we see this gravitational core and these magnetical hair-like lines and how they emanate from the core, and at the outer points, because of the surface to volume ratio and the high negative charge, they repel each other. So here we have a picture frozen in water of energy and motion. You could say nature is a wonderful artist. So that manifests itself from what we talked about last week, the z-axis polarity, where we have the polarity of the horizontal field and the vertical field of the y-axis. And then it becomes the z-axis spherical field. And when we talk about fields, we have to understand that there is no garbage field. So when we throw things away, we have to figure out where are we throwing them away. And fortunately for bacteria, is that the stuff that we think is garbage, they remove it. So from our point of view, the parasites are detrimental. But the question comes, when you look at a field and you say, okay, well, I have one field. And then you have another field. That also is one field. But if you take that one field and the other field and you put that together, is it this two fields or is it one field? So we know that the one field on the left was one, and the one field on the right was another one, but not the same one. And so when you put the two together, you have more. But really, you haven't lost the field on the left, and you haven't lost the field on the right. But so now you have something more. So another field, not the same size. And from our point of view, what is this field? Well, from the point of a parasite, like a locust, what is a cornfield? Well, it's party time. Let's face it. And call your friends. And so the point of view of this field, and from the farmer's point of view, well, farmer wants to harvest this field. But there's another type of field, like a herd. And from a shepherd's point of view, that field gets slaughtered. And of course, from a fisherman's point of view, a body of water could be its fishing hole. And from a locust point of view, well, that's a good place to eat. Where do these locusts come from? And why do they come? So one of the things we do know is why they leave. And so the reason they leave, of course, is because they're looking for the next party. So why did they come in the first place? Because that's where the party was. And why did they come? There was some attractive force. And if we see that in an alkaline state, the human is healthy, we find that in an alkaline state, the vertical people are also healthy. And so there is a suggestion that certain vertical people live within a certain pH. But the problem is that if you look at that vertical plant and you improve the alkalinity of the environment, the quantity of the harvest will increase. And what's interesting is that the increase rate is not the same for all vertical people. Which is to say that if you have a harmonious environment for a variety of vertical people, the choice of the manifestation of the physicality of those vertical people within that environment is determined by its preference. And its positioning. And should another have a greater preference for that position, well, then you're just going to have to move on. And so we find that not all vertical people increase their growth the same way. So obvious conclusion is that not all cells are the same size. Not all plants are the same size. Not all animals are the same size, and not all bacteria are the same size. So not all fields are the same size. And so there is a preference, and it affects the positioning. And so we find that the healthy cells don't have to worry about parasites unless there's an invasion. And so the question of what attracts these locusts, well, it has to do with an unhealthy environment, an acidic environment for those vertical people. And that's the trigger. That's the attractive force. That's the horn that says, hey guys, I am ready to party for you. And so a farmer looks at his cornfield as the profit that he needs to feed his family. Whereas a locust looks at that cornfield and says, we are here to take care of business. And when we take care of that business, we'll leave. And so the question that I put forward to you is, where did they come from? And then where did they go? And then we find that if we apply the plasma science to these fields, we will increase the crop yield and we will eliminate the pests. And the pests will leave without having to destroy the crop. And since the crop was an attraction in the first place, and that attraction had a strong force that it didn't just bring one locust, it brought swarms of them. And so these swarms would have to leave. Now, if these swarms were, shall we say, killed with a pesticide, That leaves a lot of garbage. That leaves a lot of decaying matter. And so if these parasites leave, then we don't have to deal with the garbage. And the question is, where do they go? And the answer could be, well, mission accomplished. So we look at the gravitational confirmation of the healthiness, and it has to do with the aerobic condition. And so we see that the oxygen is a fundamental component of the aerobic condition because we are the blue planet, the water planet, and oxygen is a main part of water. And healthy water is the main part of health. And so when we look at an anaerobic condition, that becomes a signal that there's something missing. And so that is not a gravitational confirmation, that is a magnetical confirmation. And of course, when you have that, then you start to attract things. So that is the feedback summary, where we see the sound, the light, the heat, the pressure, the luster. You can tell when someone is healthy, they have this radiance. And you can tell the superficiality when the makeup is caked on. And then you have the different layers, the laminar containment. So we're looking at the X and Y transition and the dominance of the man-made range deviation. We call this the conscious awareness, and it's overridden the unconscious awareness. But the thing is, the oxygen-rich blood becomes the Earth space spherical Z-axis transition form artifact. And this is referred to as life. So we find that the interaction of things are dependent on this positioning. And so it becomes part of the transmission spectrum. And some of it is visible and some of it is not visible. But the movement from one to the other involves a susceptibility. And so we have to understand that the physical is a superficial susceptibility. It's the plasma substrate, the internal substance that affects the susceptibility. And so this becomes our point of containment. And it manifests itself into a Magrav condition, which is a balance between the magnetical and gravitational field forces, and positions itself to one step beyond on the alkaline side and beyond on the acidic side. And so whatever in between is the Z-axis transition dimension. And so somehow there's a communication, and we have to stay within that range transition. In order to stay there, we have to release the binding energy, because we need to retrieve the beneficial energy and we need to make room. So the field release precedes the field capture. The giving precedes the taking, and the emission precedes the absorption. And in that process, we facilitate motion, and motion cannot exist without this coexistence, because motion is a product of existence. Motion and coexistence reside in both matter states. What we talk about is the non-tangible and the tangible. And so the plasma dominant tuning of that range precedes the physical dominant tuning. And so the range transition is not just by nearness and proximity, but it's by X and Y axis interaction. And we have to take that into account. And we didn't say which dimension, right? It's not man space centric or earth space centric. It's not even sun space centric. It is dimension centric. And so the proximity is dimension centric, and the pressure of that proximity is dimension centric. And 3 dimensions have to be taken into account. and then the message is on that medium. And so to determine the efficacy of each dimension, we have to understand the transmission dimension folding deviation. And so the blueprints are one way, but they don't differentiate the state. The uncut state is differentiated. So we have atoms, we have cells, we have periodic table of elements, we have life and humanity, and this is all part of the uncut maggrav state. So our physicality is designed in an uncut fashion. And so when we look at the monatomic nanostate, it too is uncut, as is the GAN state. The plasma state is representative of this. So when we look at the field state, how do you cut up that field? Is it one field, or is it another field, or is it a combination of fields, or an interaction of fields? So this becomes a universal state, and it too is uncut. So all of this, when we look at the atomic math, we see that the neutron mass equals the proton mass plus the electron mass, and scientists want to cut that up, but you have to take into account the mass of the PM ticks, the mass of the dark matter, antimatter, and matter. And this is part of the totality, and that is achieved through energy level balancing and positioning. So when we're targeting outer space, we have to maintain this balance. We have to maintain this balance between the gravitational and magnetical field forces, and also between the materialization and dematerialization forces. Because what are they? They are the transition states between the manifestation point on this Earth space and the outer space target, which is some space, and it too is gravitational. So when we look at the matter plasma dimensions and we say, well, they're physical or they're plasmatic, and that man is feedback dominant. And the reason man is feedback dominant is because we only see the manifestation. And the only one we account for is the physical manifestation. What we know now is that the plasmatic manifestation impacts the physical manifestation. So we should be looking at the source, the feeding source. And so this is the plasma shift that we have to go through and look at the relationship that the heat and transfer of energy transfer, the heat and electricity transfer of energy transfer is the lowest energy state. And the plasma state, which involves the dynamic plasma state, which is the interactive energy transfer state, is at the highest level. And so we need to graduate to that. And as they extend their little hair-like structures and their tubular structures, we have to extend our antennas and understand that there's a message feeding and a message feedback. And this is all part of the manifestation. And as we tune in, we can not only tune into the transmission, but we can choose which transmission and transition to that level as well. In other words, when we select one force, which is magnetical, we have to balance it by a force selection of another gravitational force. And so these resulting selections feed the maggrav manifestation. So this selection manifestation is predetermined by choosing. And the universal community has chosen peace. So we need to choose the peace stone with intention. And this becomes our range transition, and it affects the standard folding deviation and leaves no room for war. So to balance off the Z axis, we have to balance it to and from the interaction with the peace stone. And that's how we achieve the plasma balance. So fortunately, knowledge and wisdom can give you deeper insight, but the experience will change a man's perspective. It really becomes hard to rationalize misconduct. These historical references become meaningless. The pH balance becomes a polar balance. and the plasma balance is uncut. So when we look at the pH of a maggrav, we see there are many points. It's a perspective. There's the physicality, there's a non-physicality, and then there's the plasma reality. And so when we look at the pH of war, we find that it's very linear. And many warriors discover this too late. And then, of course, when we look at the linear North Pole and we say, okay, well, there's various parts on this planet, but, you know, there's two poles, two hemispheres. There's a lot more going on. And it's a spherical, not a linear reality. And so when we look at linear electric motors, we find that this is only in one dimension. And as we try and unravel it, we find that you can't dissect and have it exist. The blue planet is in its totality, and in some parts it's acidic, and some parts it's alkaline. The peace is neutral, and the peace is welcoming. And the peace is neither acidic nor alkaline. It is totality, and it is the key to the universal community. And so we are in the process of running these transmutation tests. And next month will be the second in a series of 4, which is going to teach us on how to understand these different dimensions and how to travel. And so these plasma research teams need to come together to be able to advance the science, to enhance the life on this planet, because that's what the life is for. To eliminate the parasites and the need for parasites, the energy binding at the expense of others. And so we as individuals have a new selection process, because we're in the post March 15th of 2024, where we have an era to make new choices. And we look at our earth space as a bountiful space, and outer space as a transmutation space. And our space is that inner space, that graceful space, the greater oneness that we've been trying for 547 weeks in a row to teach the knowledge seekers through the workshops, so that we understand that we are now transcending the limitations of nuclear science. Why is nuclear science limiting our progress? So the plasma science is part of the KAKT Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings, welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers learning about the new selection process of the new plasma science. And it involves the World Peace Treaty. And so we need to sign it. And we have to sign it with deep intention, because it's meaningful. It's our future. It's what causes the transition of the Z-axis dimension. And we find that man is a reactor of a 3-dimensional universe. And can we find heaven through this field transition? Well, can we go into outer space without a peace dome? Not as parasitic miners of the transition dimensions of history. It renders us as the party animals of the physical, spherical transmission dimensions. So plasma science needs to be delivered daily via the peace dome in exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new outer space age. That's the end of this lesson, and I hope you all enjoy the trip. Thank you so much.
And thank you again, Alex, for sharing, again, your understanding of how this knowledge sort of works in a way. We're going to open up the floor. I was just thinking, are we full parasites or are we only maybe 20% parasitic? My understanding is we absorb 80% of the energies we need and we're 20% short, which causes us to, in a way, fall into that parasitic condition where we want to take others' energies to sustain our own. So, is your understanding that we are absorbing 80% from the fields of the environment, from the universe, the solar system, and the rest, and that we're 20% short? So that would make us only, in a way, 20% parasitical.
Well, and that's where the problem lies. What an excellent question. How come this 20% shortage occupies 100% of our time and attention?
Oh, you're going to ask a question of my question?
Yes.
I like it when you do that.
Well,
And you're right. Good thing it's not 50%, or we would have no time to go to work. All we would be doing is thinking about gathering energies from morning to night. I look at the birds sometimes and they're constantly looking. I don't know if they have the same absorption. They probably do. And maybe these little morsels are just so tiny that they have to keep finding them to sustain themselves. But yeah, it sounded like you were addressing a bunch of muggers or parasites here in so many ways. I was thinking of what Mr. Kesh said about the almost everything we have, we've stolen, other than the fields we give, let's say to elevate others, or perhaps the fields we absorb from the universe. But the rest of the time, we're quite parasitic, I think, and I know we can move away from this, and but most of the things are stolen. The coffee, I make the coffee. I had to take the beans from the coffee plant. I had to take the milk from the cow. I had to take the sugar, convert it from the sugar cane, and the rest of this. So it does seem like we are behaving quite parasitic. And I know most of us don't think of it that way at all. We haven't reached that level of understanding. We think it's there for us to take.
well, the interesting thing is that in terms of our health, healthy blood serum pH is around 7.46. So we don't even have to get into the acidic state to be comatose or die. We just have to be on the acidic state of the ideal blood serum pH. So the reference that you make to, essential fatty acids, you find that one of the most important fatty acids are actually slightly alkaline. So that's a slightly alkaline fatty acid. And it's confounding in its description and its terms, but if that is the trend, if that is the direction of the susceptibility, then we find that the parasites themselves, shall we say, gravitate towards that. So in other words, we create an environment that attracts the parasite. And so the parasite is actually thriving in that acidic environment. So from our point of view, that environment is acidic. From the parasite's point of view, that environment is alkaline, right? Because that environment, although is acidic, it is on the alkaline side of the acidity. I guess just to avoid confusion, 2.4 is antibacterial. So within the pH of 2, there's an acidic side to the 2.4 and there's an alkaline side to the 2.4. So the direct jump to the next pH level on the low end is 1, and on the high end is 3. And yet we eat food that is acidic as far as our health is concerned, but we have oxalic acid within our stomach, which is at a pH of slightly above 1. It's hard to get much lower. And so when we look at certain soda pop, if you were to pour it on the hood of your car, it would destroy the paint. And yet these are very popular drinks. So clearly the lining of our stomach can take this extremely harsh environment. And yet, if we get down to a pH of 2.4, then that becomes antibacterial, and we need this bacteria to decompose our food. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the environment of the different organisms. And in the bacteria world, we find that one bacteria is a precursor for another bacteria. And we see the same thing in algae, whereas one type of algae becomes a precursor for another type of algae. And so fundamentally, when we look at the beginnings of life, if we just see water, and if we take water and say from a river, and then we throw sunlight on it, we'll find that water turn green. And you say, well, how do you mix water with sunlight and get green? Did someone throw paint in the water? And so all of a sudden this algae manifests itself. Well, where did it come from? So the answer to that question is the same answer as where did we come from? And it's also the same answer as to where did the locusts come from? And why did they come? So the environment made a calling. That was the feedback. And the answer to that calling came from the source. And that source is the essence of life. And so the calling is calling what it needs beyond what it maintains in its MAGRAPH positioning, which is the balance of the magnetical gravitational field forces that are derived from the source. So the deviation from the point of, shall we say, peace is what we're calling for. We're calling for peace. Why? Because we are in the position of the absence of peace. Back to you, Mark.
So again, is it your understanding that we automatically absorb 80% of the energies and we're 20% short, which causes us to kill and eat other creatures?
Yeah, certainly, because there's no parasite that is dominating this earth. And, you know, when you think about it, you know, we only have 8 billion people, and each of us is carrying 73 trillion cells. And to maintain the MAGRAPH position of each of these cells, there is bacteria, and that bacteria is of a higher population than the cells. So it's a number that I can't even comprehend. And these parasites are all able to control this bacteria. So whether there's an overflow of bacteria or a lack of bacteria, then that gets fulfilled in both cases, just like a locust would come. Locusts will come once their mission is fulfilled, and they would leave. So nothing is overrunning this planet because there are checks and balances. And there is one anomaly, and it's called humanity. So such a small number with relationship to everything else that is on this planet, such a small number of us are affecting the total stability of this planet. That's disproportionate. And so, we have become the parasite to this planet. And we find that when we leave, and this is true, because when the soldiers leave the field, the flowers that they trampled on may be hurt, may be bent, may be broken, will grow back. They don't need the soldiers. When the soldiers leave, the plants will grow. You really have to question which one has the stronger field.
And someone hearing this teaching for the first time, as I did earlier on, when I heard Mr. Kesh say you can feed without eating, they may think this is a total impossibility. I mean, we look at the lion, they're eating the ants and the birds and the rest of the. Are there any structures on this planet that actually exist more or less without killing? I'm thinking of some of our vertical friends, perhaps.
Well, the cyano plankton, they manifest through photosynthesis.
So again, the idea of the plants and their ability to not kill things for the most part, I think, is we have a lot to learn from this vertical family more and more. That you can survive if we learn these techniques or the ability, maybe it's through the proper emotion and the rest of it, to absorb more fields without having to do the killing. I'm not per se involved in the killing, but I do have a lot of creatures in my freezer. I will say that. So I'm part of the process, but I can't think of many structures on this planet that live without killing.
So there's certain bacteria that we consider beneficial. But since there's a precursor bacteria to create that, so the original attraction for the bacteria is of course the waste. And then once that is fulfilled, once the waste has been consumed, then that bacteria no longer has a shall we say, a gravitational requirement. So then it becomes consumed by another bacteria, and that bacteria, of course, is gravitational because now it's absorbed the energy of the smaller bacteria until it gets to the point where that bacteria is beneficial. So we see that we could take a body of water that has that is, let's say, unhealthy, and within a matter of 6 weeks, there would be the proper bacteria to grow, and then that water will be very, very clean. And so this is a natural process. And that cleanliness is arranged by the algae. So the joint forces of the bacteria and the algae grow, where one is a precursor of the other, to the point where if you say algae, oh my God, you say, well, you know, that's just pond scum. And, you know, how does that turn into a beneficial bacteria and a beneficial algae, which is now keeping the water clean? So our point of view with respect to the algae would change from being a parasitic nature to being a benefactor, a benevolent force. So that means each and every one of us can go through that same transition. We just have to understand what the intention is. And since the intention is coming from the source, then why are we overriding that intention? And so since we are the most impactful, we are causing the most garbage. And so the more garbage we produce, the more parasites we need to keep the checks and balances in place. So all this is a matter of positioning. And the point of this transition discussion today is that the intention for the parasites to get here has to do with the condition of the environment, because the parasites didn't suddenly move from one country to another country because there was a need. They go wherever that need is, regardless, because as far as the parasites are concerned, they don't see the fence that surrounds the field. They just look at the field and they say it's either yummy or it is distasteful. And so because we don't understand the basics, we put pesticides on our food to kill the parasites. But somehow the residue of those parasites and the residue of the pesticide obviously gets into our food chain. And so the cycle continues. And then we wonder, oh, you know, what's wrong with our environment? I think, you know, we have enough knowledge and we have enough education to arrive at the proper conclusion. But we have a lot of respect for the scientific community. But the problem is we also have a lot of respect for the movie stars, the acting community. And so that's one of the reasons we have problems, because we have a lot of movie stars that are in positions that are beyond their, shall we say, capabilities. And we give them the same respect. We need to understand our responsibility, and we need to understand our respect. And when we do that, then we gravitate towards the stable MAGRAV position. And that's what this earth needs. And how do we know that? Because we were born. That's why. Over to you, Mark.
I have a point I'd like to bring up.
Hi, Randy.
Hi, Alex. Excellent teaching today. You know, they estimated the global human biomass, which means how much does just the humans weigh? They estimated it at 287 million metric tons. These same scientists studied spiders for 5 years. They estimate all the spiders in the world ate between 400 million to 800 million metric tons worth of prey each year. In other words, the subset of bugs eaten by the spiders outweighs the weight of all the humans on Earth. And then another set of bugs will come along and eat the waste products from that. So when we understand about the parasites, every single one has a particular job. Like you said about the lion eating the intestines, and if you leave an animal alone, it just disappears. Nature brings things back into balance. Now it's our job as knowledge seekers to bring our bodies back into balance and going out and interacting with everybody else and with nature to bring that about back into balance as well. This year, I made some plant GANs. About every 3 days, I'm putting 25 gallons of plasma water onto all the plants in the yard. So I imagine this yard energetically is quite interesting. I've noticed more animals here this year because of that. We can't grow lettuce or kale because the deer, time it goes half grown, the deer are there and it's gone. So animals will instinctively go for the best food possible. And again, everyone has parasites. Take a look at your skin underneath a microscope. I think someone said there's 50,000 different kinds of good bacteria just on 1 square inch of your skin. They have a job. So I'll leave it back to you, Alex and Mark. Thank you.
Well, you brought up a really good point, Randy. You know, the best food that's available. So you understand why scum suckers exist.
And in your list of parasites, is fungus included? Or fungi? Is that another type of parasitical action?
Well, yes, of course it is. And I didn't discuss that purposely today because it involves another activity called fermentation. And, you know, that there's a beneficial aspect of fermentation. You know, we have bread, we have wine, we have cheese. So, yeah, this is, but yes, you're correct. Now that would be a representation of a malaise or a acidic part of the environment. And so that becomes a point of correction. Good call, Mark.
Okay, anyone else would like to ask a question or take an exception or have a go at Alex? I think he's tough enough to take it. Are you tough enough to ask?
You know, Mark, it's a very interesting thing. You know, when I proceeded on this course for this particular class, and I was doing my research, you know, I never knew about a sectorian, but I thought it's pretty amazing. You know, when you look at its structure and you say, my God, you know.
I thought you were going to say these are a type of antennae or something that allows them to absorb fields or energies, perhaps. And maybe they are a dual purpose. I don't know. They're probably made out of nanomaterial, very similar to our hair in a way. But what do I know about cytoplasm?
Well, they have to be in a nanomaterial because you know, first of all, the organism itself is microscopic. So when you look at the hairs are smaller than the organism, right? And then you see these little things inside, and they're smaller as well, but these hairs are hollow. So they are definitely in the nano range, and they are definitely nanotubes. So, you know, nature is already showing that they can do this without our intervention, insofar as I mean, the Sectorian is building these nanotubes, and it is following a blueprint, and this manifestation of this blueprint is clearly different from you or I. And so this becomes an example of what happens when you change your environment. The point of the matter is this: as a humanity, the Sectorians are not part of our family, but they exist in our physicality. So this is good that we have this shall we say boundary, or this differentiated layer between us and them. So we gravitate towards our species, and yet this earth can support various species. So in the discussion in one of the knowledge seekers workshops, we said, well, what happens if you transmute to another location and you find yourself in the midst of a non-friendly species? That would not be good. So through the natural selection process, we have to have the confidence that when we transmute, we will be transmuting to an environmentally friendly location to our species. But the manifestation of and the conformity is dependent on the environment. So I think we can safely say that this species that we're looking at is different from our species, and we would not manifest in a group with them, but we would manifest in an environment that is friendly to our species, and we would look differently. And this species of sectorians would also transmute to a different environment. And I think it would be safe to say that they wouldn't manifest necessarily as they have manifest in this planet if the environment is different. And it would also be safe to say that they wouldn't manifest into our conformity because they're of a different species.
Agree.
Oh, this is great. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. If we manifest in a different location, all the, let's say, man types would actually manifest in a very similar manner. And I guess these suckers would also manifest very similar to one another, but not this particular shape, just as we wouldn't manifest as a man in most other environments. But we would all look very similar, close to the same, I would say.
Wow, that's great, Mark. That is,
No, that's Mr. Cash's. It's not.
well,
But at least you'd recognize, wow, this one, you know, one eye and three legs, he's from Earth, like me. I got one eye and three legs, so we can sort of, in a way, gather in a cadre of sorts. At least we'll know the ones perhaps from this planet as men. The other ones, I think we'd have to find out. And even other entities coming from other planets, they land on the same planet, they won't manifest the way we manifest. They'll manifest according to whatever those energies in that structure allows it to be. So we'll still have quite a wide diversity, I think, on many of the planets as these entities learn the transmutation.
And Mark, if we had a choice, and these guys look pretty nasty, but look at these other guys that are surrounding it. They're looking pretty nasty as well. So, you know, if you had a choice, you know, you would say, well, wait a second, let me stand back and let the sectarian take charge. Okay, because I don't like these other, you know, from my point of view, I'll call them nasties. Don't like them. Okay, but this guy's getting rid of them. And then I'll deal with him later. But the thing is, he's not interested in dealing with me. He's interested in dealing with these other nasties, and he's become extremely efficient, more efficient than, you know, Buddy there with the rod. This guy only has one pole. You know, he's not a very efficient fisherman. But you look at this guy, he has 4 poles. So I'd say he's much more efficient. But, you know, both of them are getting rid of nasties, which I don't particularly like. But that's just my opinion. You know, maybe I should like them. Maybe he's
I
getting
think
rid
you should absolutely like them. Because
Explain
this is
that.
another face of the creator. If I can take the screen for a moment and
Go
then
ahead.
take it back. Okay, we're gonna try this. And let me see, we're gonna share this, but then we're gonna go to this one. Here's another, this was on the cover of the Plasma Times, which I encourage anyone who hasn't seen this publication. It wasn't around for very long, but it certainly had some shocking articles in it about a new understanding of everything. So would you say this is a picture of the creator in a way? Would you call this fella the creator? I don't know if this is a real bug or it certainly looks like it. And so I wanted to encourage the research in the Plasma Times, but as Mr. Kesh said, the creator shows himself in trillions of faces, not only on this planet, but across the universe. And so yesterday when I was in the garden, let's say, or doing a little bit of landscaping, I happened to bump into this beauty. Very small, the size of your fingernail, perhaps, or yeah, a fingernail on your pinky finger. But is this another beauty of the creator that we won't take up any war against? I just thought I'd play this. To me, this is another beauty, just as the plants are as well. So we see the creator manifesting itself. Let me just play this. I think it's kind of cute, especially the ending. And I lost him a couple times. I actually went back in the house to get the camera, and when I came back out, I couldn't find him. But then I noticed this fella again, and quite a unique structure. But I bet if I had a picture of the head, you would see the very similar to this guy. Maybe not. But so here I am photographing, and it does obviously look like a tick because of the smallness of the head. I don't know if this is a dangerous one or not. And now he's getting a little bit shy. He's going to head back into the dressing room here. But I appreciate him showing the structure. And you'll see him actually go back into his dressing room here. And he sort of kind of plops into it. But this is just another beauty of the creator or the creator himself. Thanks for showing yourself. That was the end of that. So I thought we'd have a little bit of fun with that and encourage everyone to take a look at some of these back issues of the Plasma Times. Again, 6 portals that Mr. Kesha talked about, a huge article on the herpes simplex virus and how we actually come in contact with it. And I think 75% of the planet has it. And a bunch of different articles in here. I think you'll have a lot of fun. This is from January of 2019. So there's a lot of great articles. Go ahead, Alex, take the screen back, please. I just thought I'd show another beauty of the creator or the creator himself. As he said, it's me as you.
That was a really good thing you showed there, Mark, because this is a tough question, and it could be heresy in many circles. But you know, it is worth asking if God made man in the image of himself,
He
and if
made the whole universe in the image of himself.
precisely.
And again, this is a hard thing for many of us to get over, as we thought we were the top of the food chain and the center of all things. We're just a small piece of the speck of dust in a corner of some not godforsaken galaxy, but in one of the galaxies, let's say. But we're quite insignificant. But as Mr. Kesh said, this insignificant dust is becoming quite significant in the universal community itself, as we will be one of the first to understand the transmutation process fully, only to share it with the other entities across the universe. Anyone else have a question? Alex is more than ready, capable, and willing to answer your question.
Well, I hope you guys had fun today. This process continues. All of us are looking for different ways to describe the same thing to facilitate the understanding and get to broaden the scope of the understanding. But each of us in our own way has to be able to do that, because the knowledge is not exclusive to some. It's available to all of us. So this is the challenge. How do we deal with the new knowledge seekers? How do we deal with the mature knowledge seekers? And how could we help each other out? Because that's how things grow. So we all have choices. We can live like parasites, or we can live in a community. Thank you all for allowing me to continue to present.
Okay. Anyone else have something on the tip of their tongue, or was there a reason for you coming in today that brought you here to perhaps share something that you've wanted to share, but yet you were a bit hesitant about it? Thank you very much, Alex, again. We will be renewing your contract, hopefully, in the upcoming months. I don't think the fee will be any different than you're getting now, but we do thank you so much for sharing with
There's a,
us.
there's a price increase coming.
Okay, yeah. Oh, right in with the structure, right? Yeah. Everything
Yes,
seems to be.
it's tied to the cost of living.
I thought it was getting less expensive as you absorb more fields. You don't need the healthcare and you don't need the grocery store. Um, Let me just share this. But anyway, we want to thank you all for being here today. What I'm going to do is play Keep Keshe Foundation Free for Humanity. And may you be proud of the work you do, the person you are, and the difference you make in this world you're existing in at the moment. And of course, keep the three wise men with you. They're quite efficient and beneficial for your entire structure and even structures of the others. I think this creates a beautiful shielding. Mr. Keshe does keep mentioning this ethos of Mitra, of thinking, speaking, and acting good. So remember the three kings to always, or the three wise men, actually. The kings is what we see, I think, portrayed in certain aspects, but these are the three wise men. And so I'm going to play Keep Keshe Foundation Free for Humanity. And again, the offers in the Keshe Foundation store. We see the test for transmutation. You can take the foundation up at that offer. We have the conferences coming up in Iran next and then Washington to follow. We have the research centers that need to be filled, and this is coming up in a very short time as well. And I just thought I'd bring this up. If there's anyone who can donate for others to be able to enjoy some of these things that don't have the funds in their account or available to them, feel free to make a donation. As we sponsored some people to the Sanya event. I think this was the German knowledge seekers as well. And so feel free to make donations, whether it's for a product, and you can purchase those as well, or for the research center, the conferences, or the transmutation tests. And again, even giving in that way will bring back a nourishment to yourself. Maybe you don't believe it in this technology, or it seems kind of strange, but there's something about it that you're inquisitive about. And if you'd like to help another to elevate in these, all these technologies are for the elevation of the soul of the man and the planet and the rest. So feel free to make a free donation to the Keshe Foundation. And you can designate what it's for, or you can allow the foundation to distribute that donation. And we thank you in advance for that. So I'm going to play Keep Keshe Foundation Free for Humanity. I want to thank each and everyone for being here. And again, bringing this change in a, I see the word unusual. Dean, thank we wonderful as usual. Okay, it was usual, not unusual. Who else, Randy, has said the lion's rule of the jungle. You are eating or being eaten. Well, hopefully we can elevate or become elevated, one or the other. I know the whole structure is going through this transition, and hopefully we don't have to go the super hard way. But as Mr. Keshe said in the last workshop, man may need a kick in the bum or an elevation of the posterior for him to sort of wake up. I think he had mentioned that. So we want to thank you all for being here, holding a small part of this very large carpet, and you can make a difference. I think the most important work we're doing right now is that elevation of the souls of the world leaders, the religious leaders, the scientists, and the rest, whatever is important to you. And that's a very important work to get this. So whether you can provide a nanosecond every day or a minute or whatever you'd like, you'll find that, again, you'll get nourished, you'll get elevated in the process of elevating the others, even if they elevate above your level of understanding. Again, I want to thank the Brazilian team for providing a background for us today.